With current generation consoles, we have all this power to leverage to make ports better, right? To at least remaster them in some light way, upscale the resolution, just improve the performance. I don't know, just do more than a direct port. It just feels like companies aren't even trying and then selling them at costs that shouldn't be. Or in the case of the Metal Gear collection, we actually have a version of Metal Gear Solid 2 that runs worse on Switch than it did on PlayStation 2. I'll get to that in a bit. I first want to highlight the Red Dead Redemption and Undead Nightmare port that was announced by Rockstar that's coming to Switch and PlayStation 4 on August 17th, or that arrived on August 17th. They call it a conversion to try to hide the fact that it's just a straight port. They run the game on PlayStation 5 through backwards compatibility instead of making a dedicated version of it that leverages its power to up the resolution to its maximum and up the, frame rate and just do more than they're doing right now. And on top of all that, the game is priced at $50, when on Amazon right now you can get the Xbox 360 version of Red Dead Redemption Game of the Year Edition, which comes with multiplayer and all of the DLCs, including Undead Nightmare, for $30, and you can get it on PlayStation 3 for less than $20. And for the Xbox 360 version, you can run it on Xbox Series X, and the console will upscale that to 1440p or 4K via the Huchi method. This was after Take-Two CEO Strauss Zelnick insisted that the company's not interested in simple ports. This was stated just 2 years ago back in 2021. Fans were hoping for like a remake when they saw that there was activity surrounding Red Dead Redemption 1. But if not that, at the very least, make it a good port with some kind of remastering that makes it a significantly more compelling value proposition. But what we got instead was a 30 frames per second port, no 60 frames per second, even on the more powerful hardware. Not just the Nintendo Switch version, the other versions as well, no 60 FPS, no remake or remaster, Rockstar not caring. And then beyond that, you got no graphical enhancements, no FPS enhancements, no multiplayer. This is despite the fact that you can modify Red Dead Redemption on Switch to run at 60 frames per second, and the Nintendo Switch has no issues running the game at that frame rate. This was a mod that did this. Rockstar couldn't even bother unlocking the frame rate on the Switch version, and if it runs at 60 frames per second on the Switch, you can bet your ass that it'll run at 60 frames per second on an Xbox Series or PlayStation 5 or PlayStation 4. I bring up Red Dead Redemption's port because I feel like it's relevant when you look at what's happening with the Metal Gear Master Collection Volume 1, which is essentially ports of old Metal Gear games, a collection of them put into one package. And that's one benefit I'll say that the Metal Gear Collection has over the Red Dead Redemption port. The Metal Gear Collection does feature many games packaged into one, and it is being sold at $60. You can see right here, $60 on Steam, $60 on the Nintendo eShop, and $60 on the PlayStation Store. So in terms of value, Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1 is leaps and bounds ahead of Rockstar's recent port release of Red Dead Redemption 1, which is one game, one non-remastered, lazy port being sold at a ridiculous $50, whereas the Metal Gear Collection features Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, and 3. You can see right here the full list of content alongside Metal Gear 1 and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake for the MSX. Plus, each one of these games will come with digital screenplay books and digital master books. And this is described as follows here. Digital screenplay books are a comprehensive collection of cutscene dialogue, briefing files, and scripts for every single one of the series' characteristic codec calls. And digital master books are packed with juicy tidbits and notable quotes from characters throughout the Metal Gear saga, plus useful strategy guide info such as maps, hidden item locations, and more. And beyond that, you've got bonus content like Metal Gear for the NES, Snake's Revenge. You've got the Metal Gear Solid digital graphic novel, Metal Gear Solid 2 digital graphic novel, and Metal Gear Solid digital soundtrack. So at the very least, this package does offer a lot of content. It's only $10 more than the Red Dead Redemption port that came out recently, $60 instead of $50, but you get a ton of games and a ton of content that you can sift through. There would be nothing to complain about with this collection, except that once again, there's just been not a whole lot of effort put into leveraging modern day hardware to, at the very least, upscale these games to 4K resolution. But worse than that, the Switch version in particular, based on hands-on impressions that we're seeing across multiple media outlets, the Switch port seems to be a pretty big disappointment. Here's Nintendo Live's hands-on impressions. The headline speaks for itself. Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1 could be so much more, but it isn't. Scrolling down, you'll find more details about why Nintendo Live feels this way. They call this a missed opportunity because Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty and Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater are based on the HD collection editions that were released for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 back in 2012, much like how the Red Dead Redemption port that Rockstar recently released is based on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 version released back in May 18th, 2010. Nintendo Life's report continues, we say based on, but in truth, Konami has made no effort to hide this fact, and to be fair, did announce them as such with an admittedly slim banner on the collection's promotional material. The menus for both games just flat out have HD edition plastered on them with copyright 2012 Konami still there as well. So the assumption became that the target resolution for this Metal Gear collection will be 720p, and it didn't help that Konami clarified to Nintendo Life when they asked about performance on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, plus the newly announced PS4 release, that the games will be targeting the same resolution, 720p, and frame rate of the initial HD releases. But Konami would later clarify and confirm the resolution and frame rate on each system, and right here we got a bullet list that highlights this from Video Games Chronicle. Konami has now clarified to Video Games Chronicle that the game will render at the following resolutions: all platforms except the Nintendo Switch, 1080p 60 frames per second target, and the Switch in docked mode will be 1080p 30 frames per second, while in handheld mode it'll be 720p 30 frames per second. I don't believe for a second that the Nintendo Switch can't run games like Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 at 60 frames per second, because the HD collection featuring both Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3 were released on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. These are consoles from 2 generations ago that ran MGS2 and 3 at 60 frames per second, and yet the Switch, despite being more powerful than both of these consoles, can't run these games at that frame rate. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. Nintendo Life points this out as well. The Switch version is also seemingly capped at 30 frames per second, despite the original HD releases running at 60 frames per second. Considering the Switch is more powerful than the 2 consoles that previously held this pair of games, Xbox 360 and PS3, it's disappointing to say the least that the frames have been halved. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not even just a port, this is a demaster. On the Nintendo Switch at least. And then on all of the other platforms aside from Switch that the Master Collection is releasing on, 1080p is where they limited at. They could have easily gone 4K with this, and yet they decided to stick to 1080p, which means that the image is just going to look a little blurrier. Like, it's not going to be world-ending, it's not going to be the biggest deal in the world, but they definitely could have made just that extra effort to make it 4K. That should have been a minimum requirement if you're going to launch these games for PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series. Nobody's asking for a top-to-bottom remaster a la Metroid Prime remaster. That'd be sick, but, the collection is just a collection, but at the very least, up the resolution to match what is becoming the more standardized 4K resolution to sharpen the image of these games. But the fact that the Switch version has been demastered to a 30 frames per second, that's what's particularly baffling about this port, which is a worse version of what it was on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, again, consoles that are 2 generations old. Here's the real kicker. When it comes to specifically Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, that game ran at 60 frames per second on the PlayStation 2. And yet, this game will be running at 30 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch, which is orders of magnitudes more powerful than the 3 generations old PlayStation 2. As Lance McDonald aptly put it here, that's not a remaster. It would have been better to write a PS2 emulator for the Switch than to make a crappy port of the HD collection version. Hell, even the PlayStation Vita, which is a less powerful portable console, could achieve a mix of 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second. As Digital Foundry reported here, there were momentary drops to 30 FPS on the PlayStation Vita version of Metal Gear Solid 2 HD, but there were also plenty of areas where it did run at 60 frames per second. Speaking of Digital Foundry, here's John Linman from Digital Foundry, who's baffled by this, tweeting out, wait, scratch that. Destin tested Metal Gear Solid 2 on Switch, and it's only 30 FPS there. What the heck, Konami? So it sounds like it'll be 60 frames per second on other consoles, but only 30 FPS on Switch is a huge failure. This is 100% not acceptable, especially in the case of Metal Gear Solid 2, which was designed for 60 frames per second. The difference between 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second as far as gameplay smoothness goes is significant. And for the Switch port to be downgraded even compared to the PlayStation 2 version when it comes to performance, that is a whole other level of failure when it comes to porting a game over. That is straight up unacceptable. And I guarantee you that there is a way to run Metal Gear Solid 2 at 60 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch. I'd argue the same is possible for Metal Gear Solid 3, but Konami just, I don't know, they chose not to. They chose not to hunker down and put the work in to optimize these games to run at the higher performance that they can run on the Nintendo Switch, which is more powerful than consoles where the HD collection has run at 60 frames per second. Especially because the Nintendo Switch version is the most compelling version because that's the one you can take on the go. If there is one version to nail, it's definitely that one, especially given how large the user base of the Nintendo Switch is. And it doesn't end there. Based on early reports from hands-on experiences with this preview build of the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1, a lot of news outlets and a lot of individuals have reported experiencing FPS slowdowns during some scenes in both Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3 on the Nintendo Switch. So not only is the Switch version capped at 30 frames per second, but so far, it's not even a stable 30 frames per second. Now, IGN did speak to a Konami representative, and this is what he had to say. This is not the final dev build. As you notice, there's still some tweaking to be done. There's a voice line here that gets dropped, which was in our liner notes. There's some of the content for the bonus content, and there are just a few minor adjustments. So going through, the final list hasn't been finalized, but there are definitely still tweaks and adjustments being made to the different builds. They do have 2 months before the October 24th, 2023 release date to polish all of this. So I hope what he's saying is true. It's like if you're going to downgrade the performance, the frame rate of the game, at the very least, make it a stable frame rate. If you can't even achieve that, then, I mean, we're in real trouble. I personally can't fully trust this. For me, it's going to be a wait-and-see situation because there have been so many occasions where representatives have said that this is not a final build. Things will be a lot better in the final game, only for the final game to experience the same issues the game had in a build from 2 months ago or whatever. But hopefully they can at least stabilize the 30 FPS frame rate. But even if they do, with Metal Gear Solid 2 specifically, which did run at 60 frames per second, this is just an unfortunate, very, very unfortunate downgrade. Metal Gear Solid 3 did run at 30 frames per second on PlayStation 2, so it's more excusable. But when you consider again that the HD collection ran MGS3 at 60 frames per second on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, with the Switch being more powerful than those consoles, even that is also kind of inexcusable. And yeah, it's not just IGN reporting on the frame rate instability of the Master Collection version of MGS2 and MGS3. Here's Jake Baldino, who responded to me tweeting about how this is a demaster in many regards. He said that he can confirm seeing significant frame rate drops, and MGS3 specifically was told this is not the final version, but still, it's certainly concerning. Like, why even show this preview build off at all if it's not polished enough where everything feels, at the very least, stable across the board? And then there is the way this game is packaged, as reported by another article from Video Games Chronicle here. Scrolling down, you'll find details about how you'll be accessing these games in the Master Collection, or all of the content. So the Master Collection comes in at a whopping 80 gigabytes in total, which is more than a base Switch or even the OLED model can hold without a micro SD card. And it's also, I believe, more than a Nintendo Switch cartridge can hold at its maximum capacity. The Master Collection is deliberately compartmentalized, not just on the Nintendo Switch, but other platforms too, meaning that there is an individual app icon for each MGS game, an app for the first two 8-bit Metal Gear games together, and then one for all of the other bonus content. So it's not just one app that you open and then within the app you select what you want to play or what you want to take a look at. Instead of having the whole collection as one game, everything is installed as an individual title with its own game icon on the Nintendo Switch. So yeah, the packaging isn't particularly elegant either, though I guess that's not the biggest deal in the world. But do note that the physical Switch game card will come with the first Metal Gear Solid game and bonus content such as the 8-bit games, but everything else, all of the other titles like Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3 will need to be downloaded. They won't be included in the physical cartridge. So for some of the content of the Switch version of this collection, a physical edition doesn't technically exist because a download is required for them. And then beyond that, Video Games Chronicle also echoes that they too encountered frame rate drops in Snake Eater the moment we ran through a grassy section of the jungle, specifically referring to the Nintendo Switch version, which is the version that I believe all the media outlets who got invited to this preview got to try out. I don't think they got to play the version on the more powerful consoles, PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I am disappointed in the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1, especially the Nintendo Switch version. I imagine, hopefully, that at the very least on the PlayStation and Xbox versions, it'll run at a stable 60 frames per second. But even then, the lack of just 4K resolution, the fact that they didn't do much with the opportunity they were given to leverage the more powerful hardware of current-gen consoles, that's kind of disappointing, but I was looking forward to getting the Switch version. That's the one that I wanted. To see that in the pre-release build of Metal Gear Solid Master Collection, it's not even a stable 30 frames per second, and to see that certain games like Metal Gear Solid 2 have been downgraded even from the original PS2 version as far as performance goes, all of that makes this a far from ideal package. When Metal Gear Solid 2 could run at 60 frames per second 3 generations ago, and when both 2 and 3 could run at 60 frames per second 2 generations ago, the collection does package in a lot of content, and it's cool that this collection will allow the current generation of gamers with current generation consoles to access these games, so that's great. But they could have done much more than this. And with the Switch version, it is straight up just a demaster. It's disappointing enough when a port only does the very bare minimum, when you feel like they could have pushed it a little more. But when you go below the bare minimum, you somehow go into the negative and make the game worse than it originally was. Like that how does that happen? Honestly, I would be perfectly okay with Konami deciding to delay this master collection and putting in the work to make sure these games run at 60 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch and ensure that it's a stable performance. Like, if these are the kinds of compromises they're willing to make for this beloved collection of Metal Gear games, if this is the level of quality bar we can expect from them, it makes me concerned about upcoming releases like the Metal Gear Solid 3 remake. I hope that what's going on here with Metal Gear Solid Master Collection isn't representative of the quality we'll see with the Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater remake of 3, but it makes me less hopeful. It makes me feel more concerned that they will cut corners. Konami has been treading on thin ice for a while now, and this is their opportunity to really show that they've changed, to really show that they care. And I feel like with the way they did the bare minimum at best with this collection and downgraded aspects of Metal Gear games at worst, especially on the Nintendo Switch version, I'm starting to feel like Konami they haven't changed. And it makes me trepidatious about them continuing to handle the Metal Gear IP. It makes me trepidatious about the remake. But I suppose only time will tell how all of that, the remake in particular, will play out. But man, this is a bit of a bummer for me. Or at the very least, that's one man's take. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on everything we know currently about the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.